Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 125, brought to you by executive producer Ron Merz. Thank you very much for your donation and support.
Oblivion and truth real. Millenniums perish. Feelings of desire. Therefore I'm seeing. Merz and vision. They come on my feet. Patrick hate, attraction where you fight, full of laughter, and think you resist, and they because consume all death.
You just heard Celtic Frost and Caress into Oblivion from Into the Pandemonium. The very, I don't know, some people don't like that record for some reason. I'm starting to love it more and more as I grow older. But who am I? I'm Mark. This is the Requiem Metal Podcast, and joining me is...
Jason. And once again, we are joined by Mr. Jeff Wagner, author of Mean Deviation. Welcome, Jeff.
Hello, thank you. It's been a long week. I appreciate you feeding me pizza while I was in prison there.
Yeah,
no problem. It's your favorite, so.
Hourly bathroom breaks too. We're not cruel, you know. We're not torturers. So we may be kidnappers, but we're not torturers.
Clean your bucket once an hour.
But yeah, you know, for those of you that maybe happened to miss last week's episode, Mean Deviation. Tell us, I guess, a little blurb about the book that you wrote here.
Shoot.
I'm sorry. That's all right, Jeff. That's what happens with
you guys can edit, right?
Sleep deprivation and, you know, all the things that we've been doing to him over this last week. He's
I was just looking at the playlist and thinking about it. Yeah, well, you know, the book Mean Deviation, it's subtitled 4 Decades of Progressive Heavy Metal. You know, that span, to me, it was important to put the 4 decades in there, because I just think it's such a wide and sort of vast sort of area that I put under the microscope. So there's a lot of stuff being tied together within the book. So, you know, the shows you've done, the extreme prog metal show we did last week and this bizarre one this week, are really just a few facets of what's going on in the world of what is progressive metal. Something I can't stress enough is that I don't think progressive metal is one sound. You can't say, I listen to progressive metal. Well, what is that? That could be many, many things. And I give my own definition of it in the book. And, you know, hopefully someday somebody will give their own definition of it in the second book about prog metal. I'd love to see that. I'll be first in line. So.
Yeah. And one thing you said last week is that progressive heavy metal is not Dream Theater clones, you know, so it's often kind of associated with that, especially if you've come up through the 90s and 2000s, that kind of got that tag put on it. Yeah. But certainly the bands we're going to be talking about tonight, starting with, you know, Celtic Frost, I mean, have little to no associations whatsoever with anything that Dream Theater or those kind of bands were doing.
Yeah, right. What I will say about that, if I can interject just for a second, is I think, you know, there are bands of great value within that whole Big Three world. I mean, Big Three, Queensryche, Fates Warning, Dream Theater. To me, those bands are great. Some of the bands that came in their wake, under their influence, also had a lot of value. I think there are way too many that had almost no value in terms of, or had no right to call themselves progressive. Yeah. And that's, again, what I try to sort of get into in the book. So,
well, if, you know, by definition, if they're not evolving their sound into something that's unique to them, as you stated in the, you know, last week's episode, then they're not really, you know, falling under that genre tag, you know?
Right. Look up the word progressive in the dictionary, and then my second thing that I've been saying about the book is look at the Frank Zappa quote at the beginning, and that is, without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible. So if you can't apply that to your band, and you can't apply the dictionary definition of progressive to your band, maybe you're not progressive. You may be very good, but I don't like the misuse of the term progressive.
Now,
as it relates to metal.
Would you say that progressive music in general has to sort of be challenging the norm? Is that kind of...
Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 125, brought to you by executive producer Ron Merz. Thank you very much for your donation and support.
Oblivion and truth real. Millenniums perish. Fill us off this silence. beat. This is Patrick hate, attraction where you fight, full of laughter. And think you resist, and they because consume all them.
You just heard Celtic Frost and Caress into Oblivion from Into the Pandemonium. The very, I don't know, some people don't like that record for some reason. I'm starting to love it more and more as I grow older. But who am I? I'm Mark. This is Requiem Metal Podcast, and joining me is...
Jason. And once again, we are joined by Mr. Jeff Wagner, author of Mean Deviation. Welcome, Jeff.
Hello, thank you. It's been a long week. I appreciate you feeding me pizza while I was in prison there.
Yeah, no problem. It's your favorite, so.
Hourly bathroom breaks too. We're not cruel, you know. We're not torturers. So we may be kidnappers, but we're not torturers.
Clean your bucket once an hour.
But yeah, you know, for those of you that maybe happened to miss last week's episode, Mean Deviation. Tell us, I guess, a little blurb about the book that you wrote here. Oh,
shoot.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's all right, Jeff. That's what happens with
you guys can edit, right?
Sleep deprivation and all the things that we've been doing to him over this last week. He's
I was just looking at the playlist and thinking about it. Yeah, well, the book Mean Deviation. It's subtitled 4 Decades of Progressive Heavy Metal. That span to me, it was important to put the 4 decades in there because I just think it's such a wide and sort of vast sort of area that I put under the microscope. So there's a lot of stuff being tied together within the book. So the shows you've done, the extreme prog metal show we did last week, and this bizarre one this week. are really just a few facets of what's going on in the world of what is progressive metal. Something I can't stress enough is that I don't think progressive metal is one sound. You can't say, I listen to progressive metal. Well, what is that? That could be many, many things. And I give my own definition of it in the book. And, hopefully someday somebody will give their own definition of it in the second book about prog metal. I'd love to see that. I'll be first in line. So.
Yeah. And one thing you said last week is that progressive heavy metal is not Dream Theater clones, so it's often kind of associated with that, especially if you've come up through the 90s and 2000s, it kind of got that tag put on it. Yeah. But certainly the bands we're going to be talking about tonight, starting with Celtic Frost, have little to no associations whatsoever with anything that Dream Theater or those kind of bands were doing.
Yeah. Right. What I will say about that, if I can interject just for a second, is I think there are bands of great value within that whole Big Three world. I mean, Big Three: Queensryche, Fates Warning, Dream Theater. To me, those bands are great. Mm-hmm. Some of the bands that came in their wake under their influence also had a lot of value. I think there are way too many that had almost no value in terms of, or had no right to call themselves progressive. Yeah. And that's, again, what I try to sort of get into in the book. So,
well, by definition, if they're not evolving their sound into something that's unique to them, as you stated in the last week's episode, then they're not really falling under that genre tag.
Right. Look up the word progressive in the dictionary, and then my second thing that I've been saying about the book is look at the Frank Zappa quote at the beginning, and that is, without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible. So if you can't apply that to your band, and you can't apply the dictionary definition of progressive to your band, maybe you're not progressive. You may be very good, but I don't like the misuse of the term progressive.
Now,
as it relates to
would
metal.
You say that progressive music in general has to sort of be challenging the norm? Is that kind of almost a basic assumption, or?
It either has to challenge the norm, or it has to break away and challenge what the band might have done previously.
Okay.
It's personal in that way for the band. If you're looking at it as a larger thing, then it needs to, it should challenge the norm, whatever the norm may be at the time, and that's going to be different depending on what area you're talking about.
Yeah. So by definition, then even a band that wouldn't. Like say the MC5 or the Stooges or Patti Smith or the Ramones or something like that, in a sense, we're challenging something that was normal with what they were doing, even though they were challenging what then was kind of known, in a sense, with progressive rock, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So in their own right, they were progressive in that they were sort of stripping things down or challenging what was then.
Sure, of course, and I think at some point it becomes an argument and possibly a failure of semantics. It's
sure.
Music is music, and we can do all the talking and writing we want about it, but I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is that relationship between you and what's on your stereo and how you're reacting to it, and I think that that's the most important thing at the end of the day. So. Even though I've made a lot now of writing about it, I would just rather people kind of listen to it, get under the headphones, and go into those worlds. I think that's the most important thing.
Well, and you and I were talking in between the shows a little bit about something that we stated in the first episode, which was this whole some people get into music like this because they're trying to justify their tastes or justify the importance or the musicianship that metal often does get such a negative tag that it's tough to do that. And you said that by nature, I think I agree with you, a lot of metal is very conservative. And one of the things that was sort of going on in the late 90s, and I think a lot of the bands that we're going to hear in this episode are clearly challenging what I'm about to state, was that in the late 90s, like, metal kind of was, I don't want to say boring, but it was just sort of lackluster in some ways, and it was the bands that were doing...
Everything was played out, kind of.
Yeah, and it was the bands like Arcturus or the bands like Opeth or Catatonia or whatever that were reminding me that there were other people out there besides myself and Mark and you, Jeff, and others that were in the same mind frame that were listening to other types of music besides just sort of brutal death metal or grim black metal, and we're challenging the norm, and we're sort of pushing things into new directions, I guess. And that was there was a period of time where like I didn't really understand my relationship to metal, I think, because I was kind of like distant from it. And so I was listening to a lot of indie rock or Radiohead or things like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at any other kind of scene, like the punk scene played out over a period of maybe 5 to 10 years, and then, gives way to this kind of like post rock and new wave.
Yeah, hardcore and
hardcore. Yeah, all this stuff. And I think, extreme metal was in that same kind of phase. Like, where are we going to go? Mm-hmm. What can we possibly do to kind of, up the game a little bit?
Right. There has to be a significant reaction, or else you're just kind of going to be treading water. I think, I think prog metal bands, to me, they're reacting to what they've done previously, and they're doing that every album, and that's what's interesting about. And I think that's what defines a prog metal band, is that they're they're not only challenging the norm outside of their little shell, but they're sort of doing that within it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? If that makes any sense.
No, that absolutely makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but what you're saying too about discovering new kinds of music, whether it's jazz or indie rock or whatever, I think that helps you gain an appreciation for metal when you get back to metal, and when you throw on that next metal album, it ends up kind of changing your perspective a little bit.
Yeah. And certainly a lot of the bands we're going to hear in this episode, like, we're clearly drawing upon a lot of non-metal influences,
Oh, yeah.
And we'll sort of jump into that. And I guess to get back to where we started off this episode, whereas like Voivod that we talked a lot about in part one, kind of was really pushing a lot of the thrash and the death metal scenes to progress. It seems like the other, I guess, key extreme metal band that we mentioned in the episode was Celtic Frost, and they seem to inspire more the avant-garde and black metal scenes a little bit more impactfully.
Doom and stuff as well.
Yeah, even Doom and things like that. I mean, why do you think they inspired, I guess, a different movement than, say, Voivod, even though they're kind of these twin engines of progress in the mid to late 80s?
Yeah, sure. I mean, even the earliest Celtic Frost is, if you listen to Morbid Tales, I mean, a lot of that's just kind of, it's very good. It's a classic album. I mean, it's next to Into the Pandemonium is my favorite Frost. But the thing is, it was pretty straightforward, although they always had this weird, quirky twist, and that was that Danse Macabre song near the end of that album. It was a whole, sort of experimental piece. It wasn't an intro or an outro. It took place, it was number 7 of 8 on the album. They had this weird sort of, quirkiness about them even early on, and they just went a little bit further with that on Tomegatherion, which had not only another piece like that, but I think they did some more stuff with horns or sort of symphonic blasts, every now and then amidst all this stuff.
Weren't there some female vocals on that?
There's definitely some female vocals. There was also on Morbid Tales on Return of the Eve, I believe.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, so they always had this really odd streak, and you could kind of tell that this band was absorbing some different influences that were different than when they began as Hellhammer. This was a band kind of growing up before your eyes, and then Into the Pandemonium comes out, and it starts out with a cover of Wall of Voodoo's Mexican Radio. Yeah. What are they? What's in the Swiss water right now? It's just crazy. So, and the album just got weirder after that. I mean, there's a beatbox track. There's Caress into Oblivion, which is this sort of landscape opera sort of, I don't even know how to describe it, soundtrack-ish kind of doom metal track. You had I Won't Dance, which has some kind of soulful backing.
I love I Won't Dance.
I do too. It's always been one of my favorites on that album. But it just deepens the journey even more. You're like, okay, we're 8 songs into this very bizarre album, and all of a sudden we're getting some female soul backing vocals, and kind of a groovy, beat. Man, this is just weird as hell, And
but then,
so while Voivod could be considered weird or avant-garde, their focus was a little bit tighter, right?
Yep.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. That's, and like I said, I would almost consider Celtic Frost to be more avant, than what Voivod was doing, Well,
and the Pandemonium was. And, the thing with Frost is that they weren't always as bizarre. This was the one album that they did where they were truly, truly progressive, as opposed to, what came after, Cold Lake. And then Vanity Nemesis was an attempt to return back to the old stuff, but it doesn't quite inspire weirdness the way that Pandemonium did.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
Except for kind of being the absolute counter of what everybody expected.
Yeah, well, in a
Cherry
sense,
Orchards.
yeah, Cold Lake could be almost progressive in the wrong direction. I mean, like,
I would call it radical rather than progressive.
Yes, there you go.
But it was radical. I give him credit, and you also have to understand that we're talking about people,
Yeah.
and they were, Frost as human beings went through some tough times after Into the Pandemonium and during its recording, and Cold Lake was a reaction to that. It was Tom G. Boyer just needing to party and needing to just fucking let loose, and if he wants to listen to L.A. Guns, well, I guess you got to let him, right?
Yeah.
And he wore the T-shirt, and I'm assuming he was into them, but and that's no crime. That's fine. It's just should they have changed the name? Yeah, maybe, but hey, it's. I'm kind of glad Cold Lake came out because we can all talk about it forever.
Yeah.
That's such a fun, weird twist from one year to the other.
Yeah.
I don't think any band has quite been that radical.
I was gonna say, I don't know if there's ever been a shift that bizarre.
It's drastic. Yeah,
The drastic shift coming back in what was it, 2005 or whatever with...
with their last record,
Monotheist and...
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that one's hard for me to gauge because it's like Frost was this whole, kind of like the first 7 Voivod, like Monotheist sits apart because there was so much time that had passed.
Yeah.
So it doesn't quite make sense to me in the sort of first run. I mean,
Yep.
It's a
Cold Lake makes more sense to me. I'm not saying I like it more, but it makes more sense to me regarding what Frost is all about.
Sure. Well, and the reflective time, and then they also got to see how that whole progressive metal, extreme metal scene sort of developed in through the 90s and 2000s, and they can kind of draw from that in whatever ways they want to, or just ignore it if they want to too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but if we're talking about bizarre prog metal in the show, I think Frost in the Pandemonium has to be there. It begins.
Yep.
That's where it begins.
And that's why we open with that. And I mean, Chris in Oblivion, we were kind of just talking about that track earlier too. That it has some really cool ties into the British doom metal scene, the Anathemas and Paradise Lost, and some of those bands. Yeah, a lot of Peaceville.
Peaceville 3, My Dying Bride, Paradise Lost, and Anathema all have hailed Frost as a major influence. You can totally hear that in that track, that elaborate sort of symphonic and sort of epic vibe. I mean, all those bands were steeped in that at one point or another.
Yeah,
romanticism.
Yeah, it's for sure.
Yeah, great. Great call.
And that's very much the European nature of that music, whereas Voivod's a North American kind of act. Celtic Frost is sort of bringing up that European classical, that spirit that exists only when you kind of go to Europe. I mean, you
a band like Frost a song like Chris in Oblivion, I should say, could have never come out of a band from L.A.
Nope.
There's a lot of different kind of music that's come from L.A., but it's never going to sound like that.
You got to wake up and like walk out and see the the mountains, and stuff like that, and the hills, the hills are alive, and all
have a rich century-long history instead of
Sure, and be...
Yeah, I remember taking a road trip with a friend somewhere around here in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a beautiful spring day. This was about 5 years ago. And it was just one of those days, man. You just breathe, and everything was awesome outside and fresh and green. And, we had the windows down, and we put it into the Pandemonium. And I think we took it off in the middle of Mesmerize, the second song, because we were like, you know what? We both love this album. This is not working.
Let's not ruin the moment. Yeah. Yeah.
This is not working. This is total dark room. Maybe even being a little bit drunk on wine or beer, your favorite spirit type of music. It's,
Sure. Yeah. And
not sunny spring day stuff.
Well, and I guess speaking of that, what you start to see in the era that we're kind of picking up on here, even though this record's 87, we're going to kind of leapfrog back into that pivotal year we talked about last episode, 93.
Sure.
You start to see that, the progressive extreme metal is kind of starting to travel east from, Canada and the U.S. and England more towards, Sweden and Norway and stuff like that. The Europeans are sort of taking over that genre a little bit more, at least taking the ball and running with it.
Yeah, they really embraced it for sure.
And one of the, I guess, the central figures that you talked about in your book from Sweden was Dan Swano. And
yep.
I guess why him? What was it about him and his presence in this music in all the bands that he was part of that sort of made him such an important figure?
Well, partly because he was not only a musician but a producer, and if he wasn't a producer, he was a guest vocalist. And if he wasn't a guest vocalist, he was mixing somebody's album. And if he wasn't mixing somebody, and he had like 5 bands. He had Unicorn, who were this like inspired by Magnum and sort of punk rock, and then he had he was just a really interesting individual, and he knows his music. He can talk about Kiss. He can talk about weird Canadian bands like, I think, Moxie or something like that is a band that he likes. He's a huge Marillion fan. And he's obviously way into Bolt Thrower, he listens, quite eclectically, I think. So if you were into any of that stuff in the 90s that we've talked about quite a bit during these shows, Opeth, Early at the Gates, Catatonia, whatever, he was always kind of around that stuff somehow.
Yeah.
And his name would always pop up. So he was just kind of a central figure, and a lot of his bands pushed things forward. I mean, Pan-Thy-Monium, and what I consider the sort of post-Pan-Thy-Monium project, Karabujan, and then Edge of Sandy definitely got progressive there for a while. Mm-hmm. Very ambitious.
Crimson, which we mentioned before.
Yeah, sure.
That's ambitious prog. Kind of type thing.
Total prog album. No matter what genre you're talking about. Nightingale, which was started as a goth rock band and became sort of maybe his version of Marillion.
Yeah. I don't know if you mentioned it in the book, because I feel like I read the Swano chapter. Maybe I missed it. Did you mention anything about the Moon Tower thing?
I didn't, and I realized that after all was said and done with the book. But I also, with the book, was not even concerned about trying to mention every little thing I possibly could, because there's so much in there already that I think it can become overwhelming if you're not well versed. So if I dropped something or if I forgot something, oh well, maybe I'll blog about it in a year.
Oh, sure. I mean, I wasn't calling it as a fault. I just didn't know if that was a specific choice.
I think had I caught myself, I might have mentioned that, but oh well, that is definitely a progressive album. I mean, certainly deserves to be heard and to be talked about.
Sure. And I guess the Swano kind of act that we're going to sort of play next is the aforementioned Pan-Thy-Monium. I mean, what can you tell us, I guess, about these guys? And, you're even thanked in their final record for helping, kind of as a special thanks. I mean, were you... Yeah,
Dan, I was working on Relapse, and Dan sent me a tape of what he said was the final Pan-Thy-Monium stuff. I had done an interview with him for my zine at the time and kept in touch, and he was a Voivod fan but hadn't heard Outer Limits, so I remember taping that for him. And a year later or something, he sends me this tape. He's like, "This is the final Pan-Thy-Monium stuff. What do you think?" And I was just so blown away. It's still my favorite Pan-Thy-Monium material.
That's the Chaos and Confusion, right?
Chaos and Confusion EP. Yep. Sadly out of print, but worth getting. But I brought it to the guys that I worked for at Relapse, Bill and Matt, and they were big Pan-Thy-Monium fans from their stuff on Osmos. And I remember driving to a UFO show with Bill, and we were imbibing in our favorite burning leaf type thing. And
Bill, wait, really? The same?
Yeah, I know, right. And I put in the tape, and he was just absolutely loving it. And next day, they contacted Dan, and they put it out. So, but Pan-Thy-Monium, they deserve 3 pages in this book. You want to talk about bizarre? I mean, they started out sounding like Bolt Thrower, and then shortly after that started out sounding like Bolt Thrower on acid. And then by the time you got to the first album, they were not only sounding like Bolt Thrower on acid, but Bolt Thrower on acid with like really Ace Frehley style lead guitar work with weird sound. They were obsessed with the sound of ticking clocks. If you notice, that's a constant in all their recordings since that first album. The first album opens with like a 22 or 28 minute song or something. I mean,
and they're all question marks, right?
They're way out there. And again, I think people listening now just need to listen to this next track, and they'll understand why they qualify in the realms of bizarre metal.
Sure, cool. All right, well let's check out Under Yatan. Is that how you pronounce it, Yatan?
I suppose they kind of have their own language similar to Magma. So
yeah, they were influenced by Magma.
Yep.
And this is from the Chaos record in 1993, which was put out by Osmos, right?
Yes.
Okay, so enjoy Pan-Thy-Monium Under Yatan, and then you'll hear Ved Buens Ende, It's Magic. And we'll talk more about them and the whole Norwegian thing when we come back. And then we're going to end things with Maudlin of the Well from their Leaving Your Body map from 2001 in a song called The Curve. That to an angle turned. Wow, it's a mouthful. So enjoy.
entered. Bear me wherever it stands from here. I was the storm, magic you wounded one. I was the storm, magic you wounded one.
was Maudlin the Well, the curve that to an angle turn, Ved Buens Ende with its magic, and then we started things off with Pandemonium's Under Yatan. Now, with Ved Buens Ende, I mean, we could have played any number of probably some of these Norwegian bands, but I guess in your book, I mean, you even devote a whole chapter to it about this concept of the weirding of Norway, which occurs. I mean, what happens there that gives us Arcturus and Dodheimsgard and Ved Buens Ende and Ulver and some of these bands that even Enslaved to some extent, and Mayhem that you mentioned later, what's going on in Norway? Because, I mean, they're known for black metal, and then weird stuff starts happening.
And all these bands were either black metal once or had definite roots in it or have played in other, key black metal bands. And I don't know. I think it's two things. I think it's one, in the early 90s, black metal was not quite the trendy thing that it ended up being. Mm-hmm. And all the guys making that music were just like anybody else. I know they're thought of as these weird legendary figures, but they're just like anybody else, and they're interested in music, and they were pretty well versed. I mean, Isan from Emperor, for instance, was big into classical music.
Yeah, for sure.
Fenriz from Darkthrone, famously sort of into house music and that techno and stuff like that.
Well, Christopher from Ulver, Garm was way into electronic music and stuff.
Oh, sure, and that pretty much took over their music for a time, and still sort of informs their music more than metal does these days. So you had all these guys that were just, from the very beginning, were kind of intellectual types or just music nerds like the rest of us, and so they, some weird stuff was bound to grow out of the black metal scene. Plus, I think in some cases it was a reaction to black metal and to the negative publicity that was happening and the fact that nobody was paying attention to the music in 1993 and 94. It was all about the murders and the arsons and this and that. So I think some of the musicians probably, they may not admit it, but I think they consciously turned away from that and wanted to do something that might get some more attention just for the music alone. And they began doing this kind of eclectic avant-garde sort of thing, putting a very serious twist into black metal. And then all of a sudden we have Ved Buens Ende and Fluerte, or however you say that, Arcturus.
Mm-hmm.
Et cetera.
In the woods, yeah.
In the woods, yeah, totally. Solefald, I mean, you name it. Just a huge sort of movement. So, I mean, incredible that a country that small, I mean, relative to, Germany or States or whatever, would throw up so many bands in a short period of time. But
what kind of, stamp would you say these bands have put, on the bizarre kind of metal scene at this point? I mean, because I think of a band like Arcturus that was, again, advancing so quickly through each record, from one place to one, and then Ved Buens Ende, which I think in the book you mentioned was if black metal and Jane's Addiction were sort of hanging out or something like that, I mean. Well,
that was a comment that my friend Chris Maycock, who's better known as Chris Black these days from Dawnbringer.
From Dawnbringer, yeah.
He, when that album came out, I remember talking to him on the phone and him saying, "Yeah, I just got done listening to this thing, this Ved Buens Ende written in Waters album. It reminds me of Enslaved playing Jane's Addiction covers or something." Yeah. And I'm like. And I was like, that sounds great. And, to him, it sounded terrible. It was just it didn't work for him. But yeah, it's that strange that you would hear things like that. And I think you could listen to a lot of these bands and you'd have two people hearing very different things and
sure.
responding very differently. It's I don't know. It's not easy listening. Mm-hmm. It may not even be everyday music. It's certainly not top-down springtime music either. But
well, I feel like when Arcturus, La Masquerade came out, it was like a bomb being dropped in a room sometimes.
That was huge. That was huge. Yeah. That was sort of the Into the Pandemonium of that era and that sort of in that location.
Yeah, and I'm probably one of the world's biggest Arcturus fans. I keep mentioning to Mark, hinting that, when are we going to do a Arcturus show? And he's not opposed to it.
Yeah, I've actually been taking notes, and you've now mentioned them 29 times.
I know. I'm sorry.
I'm just kidding.
As I said,
that's fine, because I'm a big fan, too.
Them and Opeth were sort of the two justification bands. And I even dated a girl in high school who was a musician. She played bass in some, punk bands and stuff. And Arcturus became her favorite band. Now, she grew up with classical music. Her father was a professor at a university, so very, sophisticated kind of guy.
Academic, yes.
And very academic. And so, Arcturus all of a sudden, piqued her interest more than anything else that I listened to. And so I think, that probably scored me some bonus points. So it's probably where I have some emotional attachment to Arcturus, on some level.
Sure. We were talking earlier about validation and stuff, and it's not like we need to validate what we listen to, but when you're a metalhead, I think sometimes people have a horrible stereotype that they'll put on you because of that. And the other thing about Norwegian bands, and regrettably, I don't mention this too much in the book, but there's within progressive metal, and especially the Norwegian bands, there was a big literary sort of influence, like For to End Yet Again.
Yeah, William
It's not
Bleep.
an original song title. I mean, they took it from, a literary influence. Same thing with Oliver, who did the whole William Blake thing.
Yeah, I had to review that record. That was a pain in the ass to review that record.
Oh, my God. It's a sprawling literary thing. It's obviously Blake is tough to figure out to begin with. So a lot of these bands were throwing in these kind of literary allusions or just very directly taking from them. And, I think that's also testament to, metal being an intelligent form of music, or potentially intelligent.
Yeah. And I remember getting that, this Buens and Flirty, I think Flirty, or however we want to pronounce it. I got them from, Service from Candlelight, and I didn't really know what, I liked them, but at the same time, they were just these two albums that showed up that Candlelight was reissuing, and, I didn't know what to do with it. Misanthropy I knew because I'm such a freaking huge Beyond Dawn fan, so I was all over that kind of stuff, but, so it was hard because you didn't know where to, like, fit this stuff sometimes.
Well, they're almost records where, like, being at the record store in that kind of environment made it worthwhile, because it was like, okay, we can put on stuff that can be, like, when do I ever really seek this stuff out? It's like, if I have the right kind of, place to where people can actually talk about it and, throw it on the background, or just to break up the mood in the store, It's like, there's so much obnoxious stuff you can play.
And that comes back to that conversation we were having, unfortunately, kind of off mic about, you and I, Jeff, were having about Radiohead and the place that sort of fit. And we were talking about your favorite record from 2005.
Hail a Thief?
Hail a Thief, yeah. And how I said, once I moved away from that record store environment, I didn't have the sort of natural environment sometimes to, like, try out some of this, like, crazier stuff. Like, you're not going to sit around with a bunch of your, non-metalhead buddies and put on a Maudlin of the Well record. You know what I mean? Like, it's just not going to happen. You have to either take some personal time to delve into that, or you just kind of hear these things in passing and go, oh, that sounds kind of neat, but I don't really have time to process it,
Yeah, I mean, that happens just as, just being a music listener, period, whether it's metal or not. I mean, I know that, there's a bunch of bands I've discovered in the last maybe 5 to 10 years that passed me by in the 80s because I just wasn't really interested in anything but metal at the time. So it's like, sometimes you just have to be ready for stuff, and it may not be when that stuff's coming out. You may not have the proper access to it, or it just doesn't fit your lifestyle or whatever, but hey, that's the great thing about music. It can always be there to be discovered. It doesn't matter if it came out 20 years ago.
Yeah, and that's why you wrote a book like you did, about this sort of stuff, and that's why we do what we do, because it's kind of, it forces us sometimes to discover this stuff because we have to do research into these bands, and, like, all of a sudden we come out on the other end, like we were talking about in the last episode, where, Mark, who kind of dismissed Voivod, or myself with some of the bands that I've, never really got into. Mark will say, hey, let's do a podcast on these guys, and so I'll kind of get back into them, and same with, like, Mark with, like, Monster Magnet or Voivod, where, like, it's something he hasn't really paid much attention to in 10 or 15 years, and all of a sudden, wham, then you're going on Amazon Marketplace and buying old records. And
sure, and but that happened. I mean, I didn't have much appreciation or know much about Pain of Salvation when I went into writing this book, but I figured I had to because they're one of those bigger bands in that melodic prog metal scene.
Yeah,
and they're fascinating. They're totally worthwhile and worthy of people's attention. And so yeah, it's funny. You think you know it all, and you find out you don't know anything.
Sure. Yeah. Were there other bands like Pain of Salvation that, like, through the process of writing this book, that you kind of came out, even any of these bizarre bands, were...
No, I pretty much, oddly enough, I had most of the stuff in my head, and I kind of was very familiar with all of it, but Pain of Salvation was one, and I think the only other one that I really came out the other end thinking differently of, in a positive way, was Extol from Norway.
Yeah.
They just weren't on my radar. I didn't like what I'd heard as they came along back in the day, and
Weren't they
when I picked
Christian, like metalcore?
Christian, nah, metalcore started to creep into their music at the end,
Okay.
but I think that was even before metalcore was a bad word.
Yeah, that's true.
And I would say maybe a little more emo oriented, but they started as a Christian Black Death band, and kind of evolved from there. And their last two albums, Synergy and Blueprint Dives, I came out like I went and bought those because I was like, these are great, and I didn't pay any attention to them before. So
were there bands that in your research kind of went down a few notches, maybe in kind of having to delve back into them, or not really? Not really, because I'm pretty close to all this stuff in one way or another. So I know what I like, and I'm obviously very open to changing my tastes. But nobody really went down in my estimation, I wouldn't say. Well, that's good. What about Maudlin of the Well? They're sort of a newer band to the scene. I remember getting this record. I can't even remember the label that put this out, but I was getting service.
Dark Symphonies?
Yeah, it was Dark Symphonies.
Oh, that's what it was.
I was the Dark Symphonies guy for Eclipse. I remember, Rain Fell Within, and oh boy, there's a few good bands on Dark Symphonies.
Brave, yeah.
Yeah, Brave. I've interviewed Brave. I remember that. Yeah.
Was Gray Skies Fallen on that?
Gray Skies Fallen was, I think, I do believe, maybe not.
Were they?
Yep, no, they were, I think. Yep.
Okay. So,
but yeah, they were on Dark Symphonies. Yeah.
Maudlin, well, I kind of dug this record for a while, but I didn't really have anyone to bounce it off with, I remember, because no one else really dug this record, so I think I just kind of put it away. But I mean, where do they fit into this bizarre scene and some of this stuff?
Well, I think as we were talking about how like a band like Frost couldn't have come from L.A. I think it's Maudlin of the Well is sort of an oddity in that they seem a lot more European in approach and sound than
were they a Chicago band? Because a lot of those Dark
I think they're from like Boston area.
Okay.
Yeah, and they were kind of like a collective. There were like, I think, 7 people in the band, and some people came and went, and they definitely had odd instrumentation. They definitely had, I think, very obvious influence from early My Dying Bride, which is a good thing. And they were just really super left of center and really fluid guitar leads. I mean, they just had a lot of different things going in, and rather than sounding like a complete and utter mess, like some bands can if they're throwing too much into their music, they always had a really great focus. And the song we heard is just, I think, testament to that.
Yeah, it's a great song.
But super creative, and of course Toby Driver and one of the other guys from Maudlin went into Khaooos.
And see, I'm unfamiliar with them. You mentioned them in your book quite a bit, but again,
yeah, well, Maudlin basically evolved into Khaooos. I think there were actually a few more than just maybe 2 or 3 of the guys. And Toby Driver, the guitarist and leader of both of these bands, has been the kind of common creative point. And Khaooos, their first album came out on the Zadig label, which is John Zorn's label.
Okay, yeah.
Avant-garde saxophonist.
Sure, we're huge John Zorn fans. So
saxophonist, if you want to say that. So they just kind of grew out of their metal shell, I think, and had to change the name as a result. But
yeah, and it kind of is a great kickoff of the 2000s, which is such an odd decade for progressive music for me, because I kind of lose track of a lot of these bands.
Yeah, it's funny you say lose track. I've had reaction from a couple people saying, reading your book, it just makes me think how the 2000s was this huge mess. Like, not in a bad way.
No.
But just in kind of a melting pot way, because you had so much, you had decades of evolution behind you now as a metal band. So there were all kinds of different metal bands drawing from all different kinds of influences, playing all different kinds of new and original music. And that's why the 2000s is, you just can't sum it up very easily.
Yeah.
And that was one of the biggest headaches writing the book, was geez, how do I possibly put these into like neat little chapters?
Yeah.
But, so Maudlin of the Well, I think, were one of those that kickstarted that great sort of avant-garde movement that happened in the 2000s and has kind of kept going. I mean, but they're really more Norwegian in spirit than Boston, I guess.
Yeah, that I can hear. And speaking of eclectic, we've got a trio of fairly eclectic bands, which Mark and I, prior to doing the show, were pretty unfamiliar with.
Nothing of.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of Frantic Bleep before because I think they were Norwegian, but that was really about it. I mean, I guess tell us a little bit about these 3 tunes.
Sure. Gonin-Ish have put 2 albums out. Their second one, which we're going to hear from, came out in 2005, and one of the reasons I actually put it on was because it's available. It's Season of Mist reissued it a couple years ago, and they've been kind of jumping aboard some really cool bands, Atheist, Cynic,
And the drummer's from Psy,
State Plan.
too.
What's that?
The drummer's from Psy, correct?
I think Gonin-Ish had the drummer from Psy at one point. I'm not sure of the lineage there. Gonin-Ish started out as an Anecdoten cover band. If you've ever heard of Anecdoten,
We used to have their record for sale at the record store. I remember.
yeah, you get 1 point for knowing Anecdoten,
Yeah.
but for them being an Anecdoten cover band, that's just crazy. It's really cool. Anecdoten's awesome, but so that's how they started. And now, if you listen to them, the vocalist is a female, and she sings her clean stuff and what seems like very influenced by Japanese traditional music, and then her harsh vocals are just as insane as like Lori Bravo from Nuclear Death or something. I mean, just off the wall.
Almost coming out of you speaking of John Zorn, almost like the Naked City, Mike Patton kind of school.
You hear some Yamatsuka Ai in her.
Yeah.
The boredoms, that kind of therapeutic screaming thing.
Yeah.
So they're really interesting, and they definitely draw, I think, very obviously from 70s prog rock. They have a little bit of that going on. I think they could even appeal to fans of like Dream Theater and those sort of bands. They have melodies that are quite similar. Moving on to Frantic Bleep, they're Norwegian. Never really had any ties to black metal or that whole scene, which I think sets them apart. I hear some Faith No More influence in the band. Really don't know where to put them. In fact, I didn't know if they qualified as bizarre, but they certainly they aren't extreme either. So that's one of those bands I can just say, just listen and
enjoy
and decide.
Yeah, they're cool.
Enjoy.
I dug them a lot, actually.
Yeah, they're very good. And another, I put them on there. They're also fairly available and accessible. They came out through the End Records, and I don't know if they'll ever put a second record out, but hopefully they will. And Egoist, this is a one-man band from Poland.
Yeah, I was reading about them today.
Yeah, who, the Ultra Selfish Revolution album is the one that you can buy. The track we're going to hear is from what remains an unreleased album called Dead Egg, and this was the debut. And he had recorded it for some small, maybe Russian label that folded. But this band to me, it sounds like Ulver playing Deftones covers with Robert Fripp on guitar.
Sold.
I mean,
sold.
What's that?
I said I'm sold already.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I love this band. I love Egoist. I made sure to print a picture of the guy in the book. If I can just help him sell one record, it makes me happy to do so.
Cool. All right. Well, let's check this stuff out. We got Gonin-Ish with Jinbaika, maybe, means parasite.
Sure, it translates to parasite
flower. Yeah, and then Frantic Bleep's But a Memory from their 2005 record, Sense Apparatus. And then we end with Egoist from the Dead Egg record, which he said was unreleased from 2007, with Eyes Full of Colors.
南の観音菩薩この世あの世一社会基盤5番嘘ばかり緑地無人足ちょうど阿鼻教官阿鼻教官
That was With Eyes Full of Colors from Egoist, But a Memory from Frantic, Bleep, and Jinbaika from Gonin-Ish. And we're kind of getting to the end of the road here. You're finally going to get to go home after a couple weeks of being in Prague hell. But
the weather here in Michigan has been fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Especially today. It's a 35.
Hanging out at the beach.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I have track practice, so we were out in 35-degree weather and raining. It's spring break, of course, which is another wonderful reminder of me not being on vacation somewhere.
That snowed 2 days ago. It's just great.
Oh, good old Michigan. But I guess in summary, to sort of see some of your things about the book, before we head out, where can Prague go from here, do you think? I mean, where do you see like the next evolution? Are there certain bands that you see as being really important and crucial in the last few years that are sort of pushing boundaries in new ways, or?
I honestly don't think I've seen a ton of real young bands. I think there's some interesting stuff going on in the world of, I don't even know what you want to call it, like post-black metal, like Amateurs or... do you know that band?
What's the band again?
French band Amateurs or Amateur.
I think I have heard of them in association with
I think the last album came out on Profound Lore. There's some stuff going on in that realm that's pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. But I'm terrible at prophecy, for one, and I also think the minute you start predicting stuff, somebody's going to come out and prove you wrong, and that may be a good thing. So I don't know. I don't like to forecast. I like to listen and take it as it comes and evaluate it once it exists.
Now, do you see like bands like?
Sorry to disappoint.
Oh no. We prognosticate sometimes, but I mean, even Mark and I, we don't really have a hold on this scene at all. Like it's metal's so unpredictable now. Yeah. You don't.
Well, that's the thing, and I as much as I listen to this kind of stuff, it makes up a decent part of my listening. I really don't think of it as a scene that's pushing forward. You know what I mean? I don't see it as a big wave. I see a lot of little sort of independent units doing their own thing. Yeah. And that's where it's at, and that's where it happens. That's fascinating. I don't think any of these two bands are really the same. So it's hard to say that, this wave is going to come and this clutch of bands or this grouping of bands is going to be the thing, because I don't really see it that way. I really honestly don't think it exists like that right now.
Gotcha. Well, I guess upon reflection, I mean, did you have as we sort of end things here, was there a favorite interview or favorite part of the book for you in hindsight when you're looking back on the experience of making this book?
There's a lot. I mean, honestly, I really enjoyed the process as much of a headache as it was. I don't think I picked a very easy subject for my first book.
Not at all.
It was tough to corral, But having said that, there was a lot of great experiences, a lot of great interviews. I mean, there were people that are very busy people like Michael from Opeth and Mike Portnoy from Dream Theater and Jim Mathios from Fate's Warning, and Ron Jarzombek from Watchtower, Spastic Ink, Blotted Science. Mm-hmm. A lot of these guys were just so over willing to help me out, follow up interviews, or some of these guys helped me with contacting photographers, or just getting that they supplied photos out of their own archives or something like that. So that was just that whole thing was really great. That people were really excited that I was doing this.
Well, I think we're kind of like Mark and I have talked about this. We did a show about 7 or 8 episodes back on music documentaries or metal documentaries, mm-hmm. and we're sort of in this renaissance right now of reflection upon metal as something to be taken seriously.
For a while now, so it's got some kind of permanence.
And so I'm sure those
exactly what Mark says, because. Yeah, it's now that this genre now has a history behind it. You couldn't have really reflected back in the '80s because it was still in its infancy, and the genesis was just beginning. And I'm sure it'll be around in 40, 50 years. But now that we do have some decades under our belt, we can do these things, and we can look at different subgenres and write history books on them, and do documentaries on them, and that's great. I mean, that's a lot of fun. And it's.
What's next for you? I mean, do you just kind of take
probably
some time
dinner?
Off?
I think, yeah.
Dinner, take a shower, things like that.
Yeah. I mean,
see your family once again.
I don't think too far ahead. No, I probably I want to do another book. I have a few ideas. I missed the process. I mean, I had a lot of lost weekends because of this book. I had to write it mostly on the weekends and just go for broke because I have a day job, and it's hard to sit on the computer after you've been sitting on the computer and try to write a book and try to be fresh for that.
Yeah.
So, as much as I, lost several years of weekends, basically, with exceptions here and there, I missed the process of writing the book. So I want to write another one. I want to dive into something. I have a few ideas, but I'm not sure yet, and I don't want to jinx it by.
Okay.
I'm not superstitious, but I just don't want to say anything until it's, my signature's on the contract.
Sure.
But I'm sure I'll do another one, and I look forward to it. And the reception of this one has been great, and it's actually kind of still ongoing.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to keep the life of this book going while it has legs. And
well, you get 2 weeks. You get 2 weeks of promotion out of us for it. So if we can do our part to help that out, that's the.
Oh, you will, and then I thank you a ton for it, man. It's been kind of cool to reconnect with you guys.
It's our pleasure, man.
Yeah, we appreciate it, and you and I even talked about reteaming down the road to maybe kind of focus on some other areas of progressivism, maybe even outside of metal, more in the just 70s rock kind of.
Yeah, we were doing the rock. Like I said, I've got some great suggestions for that, like bands like Nidrolog or. All kinds of weird stuff. There's a lot of great stuff out there to be unearthed.
Yeah, for sure. But, we're going to end things this week with Solefald. Care to kind of where do they fit in with all this? I mean, they're a Norwegian band, clearly, but...
Yeah, the Norwegian band, and they were there, in the mid-'90s. They weren't one of these bands that started as a strict black metal band. Obviously, that's where they came from, and, the earliest demo is the most black metal they ever got, but they always had some weird thing. You want to talk about literary influences, they draw from like Byron and, different influences from that, like the, 18th, 19th century literature and stuff like that.
Romanticism again.
Yes.
So
philosophy, romanticism. One of the members, Cornelius, has written a book of philosophy. So they're just really eclectic and really, intellectual type dudes, and they just happen to love metal and it's just two guys, and they play what I think is one of the most interesting sort of strains of Norwegian post-black metal.
Yeah.
And the track we're going to hear, I've been following this band since day one, and, it didn't seem like it was possible because, I thought their best albums were behind them, and then they come out with this Norrøn Livskunst thing, and it's just a band reborn. It sounds so fresh to me and so inspired that I had to play a track from that one.
Yeah, it's a cool way to sort of close things out. And pronounce the track for us. You're an expert at it.
Tittentattenteksti.
Dang, that's impressive.
One word, though. I broke it up a little bit. Tittentattenteksti.
That's very impressive. There's some cool female vocal stuff going on here.
Yeah, a guest of theirs whose name escapes me, but like we were talking about, she sounds like a female version of Yamatsuka Ai from Boredoms.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah. And I won't mention the influence that I thought I heard just for posterity's sake, because I don't want to. But
you said Dismal Euphony, people.
Yeah, I did. Oh, dang it! I
think I
take the
still
fifth.
saw one of those in your CD rack.
Yeah, I know. I got to get rid of that record sooner or later. So it's one.
We've all got guilty pleasures. It's okay.
Yeah. I don't even know if it's a pleasure. It's just guilty sitting there. Listen to.
As charged.
So a good way to close things out. And once again, Jeff, we appreciate it. The book is Mean Deviation, 4 Decades of Progressive Heavy Metal. You can give us a website where people can order this book.
You can go to mean-deviation.com, and that's also found on bazillionpoints.com. That's the publisher. I'd also like people to come to the Facebook page, which is just facebook.com/meandeviation, and like it.
Yeah, we're
if you like it. If you hate it, I've got a hate button. I'm ready to install. So.
I've been a Mean Deviation fan for several months. I was getting a lot of updates about the book, so
Yeah, we post everything there. We'll post news about. Well, this will have already happened, but we will be posting. Any interview that's coming up. We'll be posting reviews. We post every single review that we get. It's just a nice. It's kind of growing into a nice little community. People check it out now and again, and yeah, it's a good place to go. I hope to be blogging sometime soon. I'll join the blogosphere, and because there's a lot of little things that have gone on since the book was published that I'd like to comment on.
Sure.
Kind of keep it going.
All right. Well, once again, we appreciate that, Jeff. You've been a great guest, and hope to do this again soon. So
yeah, thanks, guys.
And, let us know what you thought. RequiemPodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on iTunes. And once again, we still have the contest going for the Maryland Death Fest Thursday, Friday tickets. Please promote the show in any which way you can, and then send us a link to your promotion, either on the blogosphere or Facebook or other places.
It doesn't count if you text it to your friends.
Yeah. Text it to your friends.
Somewhere other people can find it.
Exactly. We want to get the name out there. So for Bizarre Prog Metal and Requiem Metal Podcast, and our guest once again, Jeff Wagner, I am Jason.
And I'm Mark.
And this is Solefald.
Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 125, brought to you by executive producer Ron Merz. Thank you very much for your donation and support.